Hello, welcome back. This is Mr. Bossy. Thanks for tuning in to part 2 on American Yawp, chapter 22 on the Roaring Twenties. We're going to pick up where we left off, and that is with the culture of escape. In the 1800s, steam and iron transformed the United States and made freedom of movement significantly easier. Not only easier, but faster, safer, more profitable. And then by the early 1900s, gas and electricity increased consumption and brought popular culture to the 1920s. Americans really wanted an escape from daily life. People started to go to the movies, drive out of town, think day trips, road trips, that type of thing, going on vacation. And gas stations, diners, motels, billboards popped up around the country as the infrastructure for the automobile, along with the highway system, started to undergo development. And then came car racing. The Indianapolis 500 complex was built in 1909, and at the Indy 500 complex, they started to host different types of events, including motorcycle races, in addition to car races. Crowds started at around 15,000, but got progressively smaller, so it was changed into a 500-mile automobile race. And in the 1920s, up to 100,000 people would watch drivers race for a $50,000 reward. Auto racing took off in the 1920s, along with other spectator sports. Next is the film industry. The United States dominated the film industry. Hollywood was invented by immigrants, upper and middle class. Americans viewed the cinema as entertainment for the lower class. So it was just happened to be dominated by the immigrant class. By the 1920s, making movies became more expensive, so only a few companies controlled the industry. And in 1923, Harry, Albert, Sam, and Jack Warner, who were children of Polish immigrants, started Warner Brothers. Universal Pictures, Paramount Pictures, Columbia Entertainment, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, MGM, were founded or led by Jewish executives who were immigrants. And those companies that all still exist today and are still the major motion picture companies produced films portraying American values of opportunity, democracy, and freedom. Films went from 30-minute films in Nickelodeons to longer, high-quality films in theaters, which attracted the upper class. So the film industry became a national pastime for all social classes by the end of the 1920s. Some of the popular movies from the 1920s were The Ten Commandments, which was produced in 1923. It was a mixture of revelry with biblical stories, kind of a mixture of modern with traditional. Tarzan the Ape in 1918 was the first series of films adapted from the Tarzan novels. The Jazz Singer in 1927 was the first movie that would be synchronized with words and pictures. In 1923, the Walt Disney Company was founded by Walt and Roy Disney. In 1928, the character that I'm sure everyone is aware of, Mickey Mouse, was created. Initially as Mortimer, but would later become renamed as Mickey Mouse. Radio, very popular in the 1910s, and it just took off with home radios in the 1920s. 1901, the first transatlantic radio message was transmitted. And then by 1920, radios became available in homes. They spread throughout the country. They became entertainment in the living room. Broadcasts included ads and sponsorships, so marketing was all a part of it. And then by 1930, half of American homes had a radio. Soap companies sponsored daytime dramas for housewives, which became known as soap operas. Stations controlled by the National Broadcasting Company, or NBC, or Columbia Broadcasting System, CBS, and later Fox, ABC, and I mean, just think of all the channels, all the content that is available now via streaming platforms and traditional television platforms. This increase in radio consumption helped to spread American culture and introduced Americans to jazz, which was popularized by the African American community, especially during the Harlem Renaissance. And this would be the predecessor to, the 1950s when the television took off and revolutionized things again. Some famous individuals from the 1920s to be aware of. First, Mary Pickford. She was quote-unquote America's sweetheart, and she earned $1 million a year by 1920. And she is the model who popularized the concept of the flapper, and women wanted to be just like her. She was fashionable. She wore short skirts and makeup. She smoked cigarettes. So in many ways, she kind of challenged commonplace social norms for women in the 1920s. And then, of course, Babe Ruth. After World War I, Americans needed some heroes, and people looked to sports. For example, heavyweight champion Jack Dempsey was very popular. George Herman Ruth, also known as the Sultan of SWAT, the Great Bambino, all the other nicknames if you have seen various baseball movies. He grew up as an orphan in the slums of Baltimore, Maryland, and he is said to have saved Major League Baseball. He joined the league around the time of the Black Sox scandals, where 8 players threw the 1919 World Series, and it didn't look like Major League Baseball was going to be able to recover from the scandal. In 1920, he set the record with 54 home runs, and he was basically the most famous person in America. He was more recognizable than President Harding, and he was a pop culture icon. And then, of course, there's Charles Lindbergh. May 21st, 1927, he completed the first nonstop flight over the Atlantic Ocean from New York to Paris, and he is labeled as the hero of the decade, and he symbolized individualism and effort. Now some places. Coney Island. I'm sure you've heard of Coney Island. Between 1880 and World War II, Coney Island was the largest amusement park in the United States, with several million visitors a year. It included the traditional carnival rides, but also had movie theaters, jazz broadcasting throughout the amusement park. It was a cultural staple of Americana and is still revered as such. The great novel, The Great Gatsby, which I know some of you have read, was written in 1925 by F. Scott Fitzgerald. It's a great piece of American literature that captures the roaring 20s with its speakeasies, since it was during Prohibition, flappers, consumer culture, the age of the automobile, and then also the darker side of the 1920s. And a big reason people see the 1920s as the quote-unquote roaring 20s is because of The Great Gatsby. I mean, much of the folklore surrounding the decade is credited to the book. While the rich did enjoy a prosperous decade due to lowered taxes and a booming stock market, many Americans struggled, and the book, those of you who have read it, as you're probably aware, highlights many of the struggles that people faced during the 1920s. Speakeasies, which are also known as blind pigs or blind tigers, appeared between 1920 and 1933 during the Prohibition era, when alcohol was illegal. After the Prohibition era, of course, speakeasies disappeared because they were no longer needed. Those who sold alcohol illegally were known as bootleggers. Speakeasies sold alcohol illegally. It was a very profitable business. Speakeasies furthered integration rather, because people of all races would gather. They often were operated by organized crime organizations. And if you remember anything about the Prohibition era, it is also the era of the rise of organized crime syndicates in the United States. Which brings us to Al Capone, the notorious Chicago mob boss who became rich through bootlegging, prostitution, and gambling. He was ruthless with rival gangs. For example, in 1929, he orchestrated the Valentine's Day Massacre, where Capone's gunmen, disguised as police officers, used machine guns to kill 7 rival gang members. During the Great Depression, Capone ran a soup kitchen that served hot meals to thousands of the unemployed. Something that we often overlook about organized crime syndicates and the mafia is quite often the people living in the communities supported them to some extent because the gangs provided some type of service for the local community. So they were able to get away with a lot because of the services they provided to people. Capone was sent to prison in 1931 for income tax evasion. I mean, the federal government or the FBI, most of the gangsters who were arrested were actually arrested for tax evasion. It was fairly rare for them to actually be charged for crimes related to the organized crime in terms of killings and violence and all that kind of stuff. Most of them were busted on federal tax evasion charges. Though he was the leader of a criminal empire, he paid off police officers and public officials and threatened witnesses. He is just one example of many infamous gangsters who were engaged in such activity. That concludes part 2 on American Yawp, chapter 22.